Thank you. So how many of you were at my talk yesterday? A few of you. So people who were not at my talk yesterday, I basically talked about site health check and WordPress 5.2 and how the minimum version of PHP in WordPress is now 5.6. So we're all in agreement, that's what's happening, that's the situation. So there was a question, and please do move forward because I know the airplanes are quite loud. Yeah, I'll just wait for you. Oh yeah, no, it's fine, they've all moved forward now. I don't want to move the wiring and then everything breaks. Cool. So, moving your code to modern PHP, the whole point of this talk is really to talk about how to move your code and make sure it's actually ready for a more modern version of PHP. So first and foremost, just to make sure that you have context, what is WordPress made from? It's made from MySQL and PHP. What is PHP? It's the bricks that your digital home are built on. Anyone who saw my talk yesterday knows that these slides are very similar, if not the same as yesterday. And something that I want to make you aware of is that the PHP lifecycle is 2 years active support from the day of release, 1 year security support, and then it is end of life, which means that every 3 years you should be upgrading at a minimum your PHP servers and the version of PHP that you are running. Got that? Yeah. So it looks something like this. Green lights for 2 years, 1 year warning, and then death, or zombie mode, as I like to call it. So the current situation is we have 7.1, which is in potential going away at the end of the year, and then 2 that are active, 7.2 and 7.3 are the active supported ones. And the PHP community is currently working on 7.4 already, so you can actually follow along, and they do it in the open, so they talk about what is available. We have a ticking time bomb with 7.1, which is why in the site health check, if you have an older version than 7.3, it recommends you to upgrade. So that's why you get that recommendation. The good news is that WordPress Core, without any patches that you have added in, for whatever reason I will not ask, has and supports all versions of PHP. So that's good news. Aaron Jobin does a great job of making sure and keeping up to date with the latest versions of PHP and WordPress. So even now he's working on PHP 7.4 and WordPress compatibility. So that's something that you don't need to worry about. So Core is fine. But do we know what version of PHP we are running? The answer is probably not, because otherwise it wouldn't look like this. There's a whole section of out-of-date ones, which are basically around here, and then current minimum versions here, and this is supported versions here, which is a lot, and it makes me sad like this cat. You know, no one wants a sad cat in their house because they can get rather angry with you. So usually the reasons for not updating PHP comes to 3 things. 1, lack of awareness. 2, hosting providers, who are my best friends now. And 3, plugins, themes, and what I call custom code. They're not plugins, they're not themes, they're that weird thing that you built for your client, put it on the same server, and forgot about it. How many people have got one of those projects? At least you admit to it, that's good. At least you can admit to it, that's the first step. So, with lack of awareness, we have made people more aware. We have site health check. With hosting providers, we are encouraging engagement through the health check and through just site health desks at WordCamps and stuff like that. So at WordCamp Europe this year, we trialed it last year. We're going to actually bring it in this year for real with the happiness bar and the help desk, where we're going to encourage hosting companies to kind of work with us and just bridge that community a bit better. And then the last thing is the plugins, themes, and custom code, which all comes down to maintenance, which as a developer, I love, not. And so that's what we're really going to talk about today, the maintenance side. And first thing we really need to ask ourselves is, what PHP version are plugins and themes that we are using compatible with? Do you know from the top of your head the version and compatibility between what you're using and its minimum version requirement? Is like rather hard. If you knew, cycle missing, never mind. If you knew what version of PHP your plugins could work on, then you're more likely to be comfortable about upgrading your PHP version, right? Like, you know that your code works, you're more likely to move it. You have the confidence to do that. So do you know what, if you have zombie PHP in your theme or plugins, do you know if that work that you did 4 years ago still works on the latest version of PHP? A lot of people don't know this. Trust me, I also don't know this answer. And then we talk about other people's plugins, because obviously as developers, we're lazy, so we use other people's plugins because that's the whole idea. We're not repeating and reinventing the wheel. So what about other people's plugins and themes? Can we check that as well? And then again, I mentioned custom code. What about that custom code you wrote for that client? Could you say with confidence that it will run on PHP 7.3? Maybe, maybe not. You're kind of like, maybe I'll have to check with you. Okay, so the rest of my talk is about how to check, and this is what I really want to bring home. So it all comes down to maintenance and how we maintain our code, ultimately. And I hope you will stay for Alan's talk, because he will go into more depth on new code. But I want to take it in a sense that we've already got projects out in production, and we need to look after it. So it comes down to, hopefully, 3 things, kind of. So 1, check your PHP version that you are on, so you know where you're starting from. 2, analyze. And 3, update. So first of all, check your starting point. You kind of need to know where you are to know where you're going to go, right? So where are you? What situation are you in? And in this context, what you're really asking yourself is, what PHP version is your project running on? What is the server giving you? So as I mentioned in my talk yesterday, WordPress 5.2 gives you the site health check, and that's probably the easiest, quickest way to check PHP versions now without actually going deep diving in cPanels and logging access to the servers and all that shenanigans. So you can just go to Tools and then Site Health, and then go to Info, and then in one of the accordion tabs it's Server, and then there's PHP version. And ignore that long bit, it's literally the first 2 numbers is what you care about. So 7.2 on this particular demo. And if you don't have, for whatever reason, you have not updated to WordPress 5.2, maybe you don't like Gutenberg and you're still waiting for something to get better, that's fine. Site Health Check is a plugin. Someone yesterday mentioned to me that there are 2 very similar name plugins. This is the one you want, and it's Health Check as the domain. So that's the plugin you want. If you're not running the latest version of WordPress, download that and you can still find that piece of information. So with that information, we now know what version of PHP we are on. This particular demo, there was 7.2. Next thing is to analyze. And what I mean by analyze is actually just look at our code. Except for reading code that you're not writing at that very point is boring. Reading other people's code is even more boring, and I guarantee you that because I do code reviews and it's very boring sometimes. You're like, what is this thing? I don't understand it. Some of you are laughing, I know. You know how I feel. So, obviously, as developers, what do? We create tools for ourselves. Not ourselves, but the PHP community created a bunch of tools. So I want to introduce you to some of those. How many people know about static analyzers? A handful of you. Cool. So static analyzers is a type of tool. So it's not the name of a tool, but it's a type of a tool. And what it does is check for things like spelling mistakes. Some of the more advanced ones will also check for grammar mistakes as well. But I like to think of them as spell checkers, really. So it'll check for things if functions are deprecated, or check for if things have changed, or if the actual variables are not what it expects. It will check for things like that. Very simple, just quick glance over. And it's a very useful tool set because it allows you to do that first pass without reading a single line of code. You can just tell it to go and do something, and you're like, okay, give me the results. Some static analyzers, you can check if functionality will run, but please, whatever you do, do not run this on production or your live site, because they are quite resource intensive, and it might scare your clients, so don't do that. I mean, do it on your own personal blog, sure, I will not stop you, but you might get questions about why you would do it on production. Ideally, you will want to be doing it on your staging site or on your local copy of the site. In fact, in your workflow, you're really thinking about doing it as you're working on your computer. That's when you should be like running these tools. The basic analyzers and the ones I'm going to talk to you about are really spell checkers rather than grammar checkers. And I know Alan is going to be going further into more of the grammar side as well, and looking at the bigger, like more in-depth package. But I think like even if you don't go all the way out, having a baseline of just having the spell checker at least means that you're not using deprecated functions. That's half the battle. So I'm going to give you two scenarios. The first one, I'm not a developer or a coder, but I want to check. Or is it, and sometimes, you know, as a developer, you might just be lazy and you don't want to run a command line, so you just want to be able to press a button, because buttons are pretty, so why would you not want to press that button? So there is a way to click and check, but it does come with a caveat that I will mention in a minute. There is a plugin called PHP Compatibility Checker that WP Engine built, and it's a pretty sweet idea. Like, so you install the plugin, press a few buttons, literally press a few buttons, like select the PHP version you want. It currently gives you 7.2, 7.1, and 7.0. 7.0 is out of date, so don't select that. 7.1 is already in security mode, so why would you bother? You would just obviously do 7.2, right? Because you just want to know everything. And it also gives you the option to scan only active plugins and themes, or scan everything that you have. So that's all your downloaded ones as well as your active ones. And then it says scan site, which, yes, can take a long time. If you get it working, you end up with this pretty table, and it will tell you what works and what does not work. And it tells you based on plugin, which is rather useful. So it says this plugin has this amount of issues and stuff like that. And I say that with caution because it's been 4 months since the PHP Compatibility Checker has had any kind of commit to it on updates. And it is really buggy. So I've tried this in February, and I found a bug which JavaScript kept on loading. It times out a lot. And this is why I do not recommend this in production whatsoever. But it is the best tool out there in terms of plugin usage. So I still highlight it to people because, hey, if you manage to get it working, great. I would like to openly ask WP Engine to go and fix their stuff. But it is open source because it's WordPress. So you can, if you really want to, help fix it. I have opened a ticket to ask them to add in PHP 7.3 checks and just tidy it up. And I have talked to them in person as well. So yeah, anyone here from WP Engine, please fix this plugin because I love it. It just doesn't work at the moment, for me at least, which is sad, really sad. Or if anyone wants to send this letter to WP Engine on Twitter, feel free. The second scenario is you're currently working on a project. Maybe your client has finally agreed to do that update and they're giving you time to do this maintenance, magical maintenance mode and sprint. So at a base level, the tools that you'll need for your workflow are things called Composer, PHP Compatibility WP, and WordPress coding standards. These are the three things you need to install and the three things that you will need to get going. I'm not going to sit here and tell you how to do it because the documentation on the Composer website, on the PHP Compatibility website, and on WordPress Coding Standards is very, very thorough. But if you're in doubt, my colleague Thorsten actually wrote up a blog post just for this talk about how to set up modern PHP coding standards for WordPress. And it's basically how I do it as well. So he goes through and links you to the correct locations. And so please do read through that. And if you have any questions, comment on his blog so that he can handle the issues and I don't. Awesome. Yes, that's how I like to do things. So where would you do this in your workflow? Where would you have these tools in your workflow? I would have them locally on my machine. I would install them locally, and in fact, I would install them globally on my machine so that all my projects, regardless of if it has PHP or not, I can run on. I would have it linked so that it would run automatically before any commits go. So before you commit something, it just runs that check. It will mean when you're committing something, it will take longer because you're having to run the test. And depending on how much code you've changed and how much code you're asking it to run on, can mean it's a long time, but at least then it's consistent. And always I would recommend before the code is pushed to staging or production. So in larger companies, there's this concept of continuous integration and continuous deployment. And you can use tools like Travis CI and Circle CI to actually run these tests when someone does a pull request. So when you request for something to be merged, it will actually run the test for you at that point. And then it will tell you whether there are issues in the files that you have changed or not, which is very, very useful. When you run these tools, you'll run them on the command line usually. Some IDEs also allow you to run them in the IDE, like PHP Storm. And the PHP Storm have lots of information about this. But I run them on the command line because without the GUI interface, without the graphical interface, it's actually a lot faster and it doesn't slow my computer down. You end up with something like this. So I was on a version of a WordPress local installation. I ran Composer PHP CS in the terminal, and everything from this arrow is what I got back. And that, if you've never done it, looks quite scary. There's lots of dots. There's these S's and E's and W's and numbers on the end that don't make sense. Has no labels in it whatsoever. It's just confusing. But I worked out what they mean, so this is what it means. E means error found. So what it does, these dots, what actually happens is these dots is like the test going, and then every time it finds an error, a warning, that it can't do something in the file, it comes up with these letters. So E is for error, so it goes error, and it puts an E in. And then it goes next, and then when it goes for something like, oh, it's not an error, but it's kind of not very good, it goes warning, and then draws out a W, and then carries on going. And it tells you really how many files it can see and what it found. The S is for skipped files. So for whatever reason, it did not review that file. And then on the side, these numbers actually mean the amount of files it's checked and the percentage of the project. So you can see progress as it's going along, which I really like because sometimes the terminal just kind of tells you nothing and then everything in once, and it's confusing and scary because there's too much information. After you get this table of information, you then get a list of the errors and the warnings that have come up during the test. And on first glance, it kind of looks pretty, but also is quite daunting. But you can break it down again. The very top of each section, there's two sections here. This is one section, and then the bottom one's the second section. It tells you the file that it's going to talk about, so you know where and which file the issue has occurred in. It tells you what line it thinks the error is in, or the warning that it is in. And it tells you if they found an error or a warning. And so it does it per file. So if a file has multiple errors or multiple warnings, it will just draw a table out and tell you exactly where exactly it is. And then this crazy long thing in brackets that you see, it's actually the rule that has been broken. And if you take that rule, stick it into any search engine of your choice, you will actually get more information about that error, and people generally have written about the common error and how they fixed it. So that actually helps you solve the problem a bit faster as well. We all good? Not scared so far? No, good. Carry on. So the other thing that I mentioned was WordPress coding standards. The WordPress coding standards, how many people here know about the WordPress coding standards? There's a few. There's a WordPress coding standards is a way to ensure the way we talk about WordPress and write WordPress code in a consistent manner across the ecosystem. And so especially a lot of the larger agencies like HumanMade and 10up, for example, both companies use WordPress coding standards, which means that if I looked at a 10up project, because they're using the same coding standards, I should be able to understand their project a bit faster than someone who's not using the coding standards. I'm not saying it always works, but the idea is there. The WordPress coding standards also tell you about deprecated functions in WordPress. So as WordPress change or functions don't work the same way, it will highlight them to you, which is very useful. And it will also tell you about common security issues. And it will be very simple ones, but very useful. And it's things like escaping and MySQL prepare statements. So if it detects that you've got MySQL statement, but there's no prepare around it, it'll tell you and be like, hey, are you sure you don't want to prepare this thing? Are you sure you don't want to escape this echo, whatever it is, or sanitize it? And so these things are rather useful because as engineers, sometimes we just forget. And that's okay. Now that we've analyzed our code, and now that we know, the kind of issues that we're going to have to deal with, we need to update the code itself. And I like to think of it as a migration time. We're going to migrate from one version of PHP to the next. And your best friend, ultimately, is the PHP.net manual. It looks a lot nicer than it used to 5 years ago, so be appreciative of the new design. But the PHP.net manual is very verbose about what has changed over time, and it's very, very useful. If you look up PHP.net or look up migrating from one PHP version to the next, you actually get this website. And you can't really see it very well here, but I'll share my slides online afterwards. But on the side here, there's an appendices. It tells you the history of the PHP project, and it has lists of migrating from PHP 4 to PHP 5, just in case you need to. I'm not going to ask why. Or migrating from PHP 5 to 5.1, 5.1 to 5.2, and so on. They have an extensive piece of documentation which tells you exactly what changes have happened, what has been broken, and what you need to do to move from one version of PHP to the next. And so because that is extensive, that is very useful. So my recommendation is to start at your current PHP version, whatever version that is. Maybe it's PHP 5.2. Use a static analyzer, and then check the migration guide for the next version of PHP to see where you're going, and then update your code and repeat that and move from one step to the next. Now, that's rather time consuming because if you're going from 5.2, you're doing 5.2 to 5.3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 5.6 to 7, 7 to 7.1, 7.1 to 7.2, 7.2 to 7.3. That's 8 versions of PHP that you would be migrating from. And that's mentally a lot of work. So I wouldn't say you do them all, but there are key PHP versions where a lot of things were deprecated. So you don't want to do from 5.2 to 7.3, for example, because there'll just be too much noise and it'll probably overwhelm you. And I don't want you to feel scared of this. So this is what I recommend based on the amount of deprecation that has happened and the amount of changes, and also based around a little bit around just talking to hosting providers where they've seen major issues come up. So 5.2 to 5.3 is a big jump. 5.3 to 5.6, another jump. And then 5.6 to 7. And then once you're at 7, you can go from 7 to 7.2 or even 7.3. I'm not sure why I wrote 7.2 there, probably because I forgot. So that turns it into 4 steps instead of 8. So you've cut that down by a half. You're still going to get a fair amount of noise, especially at the beginning. And it's quite nice actually, because the more you do it, the less noise there is. So once you get to 7, it's actually a lot easier to keep going and keep that habit up. It's just the further away and further apart you are, the more work you're going to have to do, because the gap is bigger, obviously. So that's just something to be mindful of. And 5.2 to 5.3 especially is a big jump. So, like I said before, use the information on here once you've worked out where you need to go, and with your code, go and check for these things. Do good old search and replace. Literally find where you've mentioned a backwards function and make sure that you replace it with the new one and make sure it still works. Another thing you can do then is also set your plugin minimum requirements. And what I mean by that is you can actually set a minimum PHP version requirement in your plugin README file. And this is really, really powerful for 2 reasons. One, any user who doesn't have a version of PHP that you support, you can literally say unsupported, go away, which is a bit mean and not exactly the best citizen in the world, but at least you can be encouraging them to move up, and actually your target PHP range is a lot smaller then. And this is one way that plugin developers can really move that ball. People like Yoast did it probably about a year ago, back a year and a half ago, where they, in their SEO plugin, said, we're not supporting the older versions of PHP, we're supporting a minimum version. And when I talked to Omar about this and I asked him how much support he actually got from that, he said a handful, literally 1 handful. He was like, we didn't even really talk about it. So the fact that it really didn't affect them too much, and that's one of the bigger plugins in the world, I would say that most of the time you're going to be okay. The way you do it is in the plugin README file, which I know seems a bizarre place to put it, but that's where it is. There is a requires PHP tag that you can add in, and then you can set whatever the minimum requirement you want. And be careful to remember that it's not just saying the one that all the requirements, it's just the minimum requirement that you want. And what that does is it goes into the plugin directory, and then the PHP version tells you like it's 7.1 or higher. The language actually has changed a little bit, so it says minimum PHP version now. So it's minimum PHP version 7.1 or higher. So it really encourages people to think about what they can install and can't. And one of the things the plugin team are going to be doing is checking what version of PHP you are running as a user, checking then what the plugin minimum requirement is, and if they don't match, it won't allow them to download it. So that also gives you a lot more weight in encouraging people to move up. There are some things to be aware of. Some functionality outputs have changed in PHP functions especially. So maybe it was a function like hello, open brackets, and it was A, then B, and now it will be hello, B, then A, which means that the arguments have changed, which is really annoying as a PHP developer. But they do tell you when it's changed, so do be aware of that. Another thing is that I'd like to highlight is that some runtime errors will not be detected by a static analyzer. So you can't do this and assume that you don't have to check your work and just quickly check your project. Still go in, press the buttons, and make sure things work the way you expect it. Nothing beats human testing, like nothing. Not even the things that Alan is going to suggest. He looks at me like disbelief. And the other thing is, the messier the code, the harder it is for the tools to detect issues. So if you're writing long procedural code, some of the tools that we have will not detect things as well as if you write it in an object-oriented way. That isn't to say that you should write everything in object-oriented way. It's just something to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is there can be false positives. We're talking about computers and code that someone has written testing our code. They are not human. They will not catch everything, and they will not know the context of what we are doing. So it's really important to not look at this information and say, okay, I just need to get 100%. You really need to think about what you're doing as you do in all your development work. The upside is, you're upgrading PHP, you're going to get better performance for your clients and yourself. We're going to use less computer resources. We're going to save a polar bear in the process, which I love. It also means that you're going to have fixed PHP bugs. PHP datetime does not work properly in anything less than 7.1, I think. So if you're on older versions of PHP than 7.1, there are bugs in PHP datetime that you have literally written the solution to get around it. And I could give a whole talk about PHP datetime, but at least it's fixed in the later version. So please do upgrade, even just to keep your sanity going. Also, I mentioned it before, you're going to have PHP support, security support as well. And there are lots of new cooler functions and features for developers as ourselves to use. So at least that way, it makes it easier to maintain going forward. There's a bunch of resources I really recommend. The first two are talks from Lorna J. Mitchell. She gave a talk at WordCamp London in 2015 about upgrading from PHP 5.4 upwards. And her slides are available on her website as well, so I've linked them here. Your hosting providers might have documentation on how to do migrations within their hosting provider as well. Some of them have better documentations than others, so do check that out. PHP.net manual, the WordPress coding standards and how to use it, that's really, really useful as well. And also, Cloudways did this really nice cheat sheet, which tells you from X to X, so that's quite a nice, if you like cheat sheets, I do, and that's a good one. And also, Thorsten's, like I said before, his blog post was really, really useful because there wasn't really anything that was written for WordPress, so do have a look at that. And last note, if in doubt, ask the community. There's lots of us here, and there's lots of us online, especially globally, so ask. It's always encouraging to see people ask technical questions, so I really encourage it. And also, you have a Portuguese community on forums, so help each other as well. It's the only way forward, really, in this crazy world that we live in. Obrigado, and if anyone's got any questions, you can ask me now or you can ask me later. Thank you.